Finally, that burden is gone. Finally, we can live our lives without him draining everything from us, Kwame announced, his voice echoing through the sterile hospital corridor. His wife Min-Ji nodded slowly, her expression cold and calculated. "Thank God this nightmare is over," she whispered. "We can finally travel, enjoy our money, live the life we deserve without his medical bills bankrupting us." They stood outside room 307, where their 19-year-old son Kofi lay connected to machines, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. The doctors had declared him brain dead after the terrible car accident. They had said there was no hope, that his chances of recovery were almost non-existent. His parents had heard those words and immediately began planning. But what Kwame and Min-Ji didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that behind those closed eyelids, behind that still face, their son was conscious. He could hear every single word. He could hear his father's relief. He could hear his mother's joy. He could hear them celebrating his death while his heart still beat, while his mind still worked, trapped inside a body that refused to respond. Before we continue, I need you to do something important. Drop a comment right now and tell me which country you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. Kofi had always been the kind of son who tried too hard. From the moment he could walk, he had been chasing his parents' approval like it was oxygen. He remembered staying up until 3 a.m. studying for exams, not because he loved learning, but because he wanted to see his father smile. He remembered joining the track team even though he hated running, because his mother had mentioned once that athletes were impressive. He remembered cooking elaborate Korean meals for Min-Ji, spending hours perfecting recipes from her childhood, hoping she would finally say she was proud of him. He remembered washing his father's car every Sunday morning, polishing it until it gleamed, waiting for a simple thank you that rarely came. For 19 years, Kofi had bent himself into impossible shapes, trying to fit into the mold of the perfect son. He had sacrificed friendships because his parents said his friends were distractions. He had given up his dream of becoming an artist because Kwame had laughed and called it a hobby for unemployed people. He had worked 3 part-time jobs during high school to help with family expenses, even though his parents owned 2 successful restaurants and a rental property business. And now, lying in this hospital bed, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to even flutter an eyelid, Kofi understood the devastating truth. None of it had mattered. None of his sacrifices had been seen. None of his efforts had been valued. The accident had happened on a Tuesday evening. Kofi had been driving home from his campus library, exhausted after a 12-hour study session for his engineering finals. A drunk driver had run a red light and slammed into his car at 60 miles per hour. The impact had been catastrophic. When the paramedics arrived, they had found him unconscious, bleeding, broken. They had rushed him to the hospital, performed emergency surgery, stabilized his vital signs. Then came the neurological assessments, the brain scans, the grim conversations with specialists. The doctors had explained to Kwame and Min-Ji that their son had suffered severe traumatic brain injury. They had used terms like diffuse axonal injury, Glasgow Coma Scale score of 3, and persistent vegetative state. They had said that while his body was alive, his brain showed minimal activity. They had said the chances of meaningful recovery were less than 5%. They had said the family should prepare for the worst. Kwame had listened to all this with a blank expression. Min-Ji had cried, but not the tears of a mother losing her child. They were tears of someone mourning the financial burden ahead, the disruption to her carefully planned life. That first night, after the doctors left, Kofi had heard them in his room. He remembered the sensation of waking up inside his own body, his consciousness returning like a light slowly brightening in a dark room. At first, he thought he was dreaming. Everything felt distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. Then the sounds became clearer. Voices. His father's voice. "How much will keeping him alive cost us?" Kwame had asked, not to Kofi, but to Min-Ji. They were standing at the foot of his bed, speaking as if he were already gone. "The insurance will cover some of it," Min-Ji had replied, her voice practical and detached, "but long-term care facilities are expensive. If he stays like this for years, it could drain everything we've built." Kofi had wanted to scream. He had wanted to sit up, to shake them, to tell them he was still here, still present, still their son. But his body was a prison. His vocal cords wouldn't respond. His fingers wouldn't curl. His eyes wouldn't open. He was trapped, completely and utterly trapped, forced to listen as his parents discussed him like he was a financial liability, a problem to be solved. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. "Maybe this is for the best," Kwame had said after a long silence. The words had hit Kofi like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Min-Ji had asked, though her tone suggested she understood perfectly. "I mean," Kwame continued, his voice dropping lower, "he's been struggling for years. His grades were never good enough. He couldn't get into the top engineering program. He's been working himself to death trying to prove something, and for what? Maybe this is nature's way of ending his suffering." Min-Ji had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said something that shattered whatever remained of Kofi's heart. "You're right. He's been a burden since he was born. Always needing something, always falling short, always disappointing us. If he doesn't wake up, maybe that's the universe telling us it's time to let go." They had stood there, in the dim light of the hospital room, discussing their son's potential death with the same tone they might use to discuss selling an old car. Kofi had screamed inside his mind, but his body had betrayed him completely. Not a single muscle had twitched. Not a single tear had fallen from his closed eyes. The days that followed had been an endless loop of torture. Nurses came and went, adjusting his 4 drips, checking his vitals, speaking to him in gentle voices as if he could hear them. He could hear them. He could hear everything. But he couldn't respond. Kwame visited every morning before work. He never held Kofi's hand. He never spoke words of encouragement. Instead, he would sit in the chair beside the bed, scroll through his phone, and occasionally sigh deeply, as if the act of visiting was itself a monumental sacrifice. Sometimes he would make phone calls, conducting business as if Kofi weren't even there. "I'm at the hospital with my son," he would say to clients, his voice heavy with performative grief. "Yes, it's very difficult. Thank you for your prayers." Then he would hang up and immediately start laughing at something on his phone, the mask of the grieving father dissolving the moment he thought no one was watching. Min-Ji's visits were worse. She would arrive in the afternoons, dressed impeccably, her makeup perfect, her demeanor that of someone visiting a distant acquaintance rather than her dying child. She would stand at the foot of the bed and stare at him with cold assessment. "Such a waste," she had said once, more to herself than anyone else. All those years of feeding him, clothing him, paying for his education. And this is how it ends. She had pulled out her phone and started researching long-term care facilities, reading reviews aloud as if Kofi were a piece of furniture that needed storage. "This one is affordable," she had mused, "but the reviews say the staff is neglectful. This one is nicer, but it costs 3 times as much. Maybe we should just see what the doctors recommend and go with the cheapest option. He won't know the difference anyway." Kofi had listened, horror building inside him with each word. He had given these people everything. He had molded his entire existence around their expectations, their demands, their impossible standards. And now, in his most vulnerable moment, they were calculating the cost of keeping him alive like he was a subscription service they were considering canceling. The worst visit came on the 6th day. Kwame and Min-Ji had arrived together, which was unusual. They had closed the door behind them, which immediately set off alarm bells in Kofi's conscious mind. "We need to talk about something serious," Kwame had begun, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The doctors said he could stay like this for months, even years. They said there's a chance he'll never wake up." Min-Ji had moved closer to the bed. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about quality of life. Is it fair to keep him alive like this, trapped in his own body, unable to communicate, unable to live any kind of meaningful existence?" Kwame had nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. If he could tell us what he wanted, I'm sure he would say he doesn't want to live like a vegetable." Kofi's mind had exploded with panic. They were talking about pulling the plug. They were discussing ending his life. And they were framing it as mercy, as if they were doing him a favor. Min-Ji had continued, her voice taking on a rehearsed quality, as if she had practiced this speech. "The medical bills are already piling up. Our savings are being drained. If this continues, we could lose the restaurants, lose the rental properties, lose everything we've worked for." Kofi wanted to scream that he was still there, that he could hear them, that he was fighting to come back. But his body remained stubbornly unresponsive. "Is there a way to," Kwame had hesitated, "to speed things up?" Min-Ji had glanced toward the door, making sure it was closed. "The doctors mentioned something about do not resuscitate orders. If his heart stops, they won't try to bring him back. It would be natural. Peaceful." "Natural," Kwame had repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes. That makes sense. We wouldn't be killing him. We'd just be letting nature take its course." They had stood there, making plans for Kofi's death, and then they had left to find a doctor to discuss the DNR order. Kofi had been alone in the room, his mind racing, his body frozen. He had tried with every ounce of strength to move something, anything, a finger, a toe, an eyelid. Nothing had responded. He was completely at their mercy, and they had none. That night, a nurse named Abina had come to check on him. She was a kind woman in her 50s, with gentle hands and a soft voice. She had been talking to him since the first day, treating him like a person rather than a body. "Some people think you can't hear us when you're like this," she had said, adjusting his blanket, "but I don't believe that. I think you're in there, fighting. I think you're aware. And I want you to know that you're not alone. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless." Kofi had felt something crack open inside him at her words. For the first time since the accident, someone was speaking to him like he mattered. "If you can hear me," she had continued, "I want you to keep fighting. I've seen miracles in this hospital. I've seen people wake up when everyone said they wouldn't. Don't give up." She had held his hand for a moment, and Kofi had focused every fragment of his consciousness on that hand, trying to squeeze back, trying to send her a signal. Nothing had moved, but Abina had smiled anyway. "I'm going to keep talking to you," she had said. "I'm going to keep believing you're in there. And when you wake up, because I believe you will, you're going to have quite a story to tell." Over the following days, Abina became Kofi's anchor to hope. She would come during her shifts and tell him about her day, about her grandchildren, about the news. She would read him articles from the newspaper, play music on her phone, describe the weather outside his window. She treated him like a human being, and it made all the difference. Meanwhile, Kwame and Min-Ji's visits became more brazen in their cruelty. They had signed the DNR order, and it seemed to give them permission to speak even more freely. "At least when this is over, we can finally take that trip to Seoul we've been planning," Min-Ji had said one afternoon, filing her nails while sitting beside Kofi's bed. "I've already started looking at flights." Kwame had laughed. "Maybe we should book it now. Give ourselves something to look forward to." They had begun discussing their post-Kofi life with increasing enthusiasm, as if his death were already a done deal. They talked about remodeling the house, about expanding the restaurant business, about all the money they would save without his existence draining their resources. "You know what I won't miss," Min-Ji had said one day, her voice dripping with disdain, "his constant need for validation. Always asking if we were proud of him, always seeking approval like a puppy begging for scraps." It was exhausting. Kwame had agreed. He never understood that respect is earned, not given. He thought if he just worked hard enough, tried hard enough, we would magically be satisfied. But effort without results is just noise. Kofi had heard every word, and each one had carved deeper into his soul. But something else was happening too. With each cruel comment, with each dismissive laugh, with each heartless plan, something hardened inside him. The desperate, approval-seeking boy was dying, and someone else was being born in his place. Someone who understood that his parents' love had always been conditional, transactional, and ultimately hollow. Someone who realized that he had wasted 19 years chasing something that had never existed. Someone who decided that if he ever got out of this bed, he would never again beg for crumbs from people who saw him as a burden. On the 14th day, something changed. Kofi felt a tingling in his right hand. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. He focused all his attention on that sensation, willing it to grow stronger. Over the next few hours, the tingling spread up his arm. By evening, he could feel his fingers. He tried to move them. Nothing happened at first, but then, after what felt like hours of intense concentration, his index finger twitched. It was the smallest movement, barely a millimeter, but it was movement. He was coming back. The next day, Abina noticed. She had been checking his vitals when she saw his finger move. Her eyes had widened. "Kofi," she had whispered urgently, "if you can hear me, try to move your finger again." He had focused every ounce of energy on that finger, and it had twitched again, more noticeably this time. Abina had gasped, tears filling her eyes. "You are in there. I knew it. I knew you were fighting. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless." She had immediately called for the doctor, and within minutes, Kofi's room had been filled with medical staff. They had performed tests, shining lights in his eyes, testing his reflexes, speaking to him in encouraging tones. The neurologist had been cautiously optimistic. "This is remarkable," he had said. "We're seeing signs of consciousness returning. It's too early to say how much function he'll recover, but this is definitely progress." When Kwame and Min-Ji had arrived later that day, the doctor had given them the update. They had listened with frozen expressions. "That's wonderful news," Kwame had said, his voice flat and unconvincing. "Yes," Min-Ji had echoed, though her eyes had betrayed her true feelings. She looked terrified. After the doctor left, they had stood in silence for a long moment. Then Min-Ji had spoken quietly. "If he wakes up, he'll need constant care. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, possibly years of rehabilitation." Kwame had run a hand over his face. "The costs will be astronomical." They hadn't said it out loud, but Kofi could sense their thought. It would have been easier if he had just died. But Kofi wasn't dying. Day by day, he was clawing his way back. On the 18th day, he could move his hand. On the 20th day, he could open his eyes for brief moments. On the 23rd day, he could turn his head slightly. The medical team was astounded by his progress. They called it miraculous. They said he was defying every statistical probability. But Kofi knew the truth. He wasn't recovering because of medicine or luck. He was recovering because of rage. Pure, focused, burning rage at the people who had celebrated his death, who had planned their future around his absence, who had revealed themselves to be exactly what he had always feared they were, people who had never truly loved him. On the 25th day, he could whisper. His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but it was there. Abina had been in the room when he spoke his first words. "Don't tell them," he had rasped. She had understood immediately. "Don't tell your parents you can speak." He had managed the smallest nod. Abina had hesitated, conflict clear on her face. "Kofi, they're your parents. They've been here every day." He had looked at her with eyes that carried too much knowledge, too much pain. "Please," he had whispered. "Trust me." Something in his expression had convinced her. She had nodded slowly. "Okay. But only for a little while. You need to talk to someone about whatever's going on." Kofi had spent the next 3 days pretending to be less aware than he was. When Kwame and Min-Ji visited, he would keep his eyes closed, his body still. He would listen to them talk about him like he was already gone, like his slight improvements were just temporary blips before the inevitable end. "The funeral home gave us some package options," Min-Ji had said casually on the 27th day, as if discussing catering choices for a party. "I think we should go with the basic option. No need to be extravagant." He wouldn't have wanted us to waste money. Kwame had agreed. "Keep it simple. A small service, cremation, nothing elaborate. We can use the money we save to finally renovate the kitchen in the restaurant." They had laughed together, a shared moment of relief and anticipation, completely unaware that their son was conscious, aware, and listening to every word. That night, after they left, Kofi had asked Abina to help him sit up. It had been agonizingly difficult, his muscles weak from weeks of immobility, but he had managed it. He had asked her to bring him his phone. When she handed it to him, his fingers had trembled as he unlocked it. The first thing he did was check his bank accounts. What he saw made him smile for the first time in weeks. "Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless." Before the accident, Kofi had been working on something his parents knew nothing about. While they had dismissed his dreams of being an artist, while they had mocked his creative pursuits, he had been quietly building something. For 2 years, he had been creating digital art and selling it as NFTs. He had started small, just a hobby, something to express himself when the pressure of being the perfect son became too much. But his work had resonated with people. His art, which explored themes of identity, displacement, and the immigrant experience, had found an audience. Sales had started small, a few $100s here and there. Then one of his pieces had been featured by a major crypto art collector. Suddenly, his work was in demand. By the time of the accident, Kofi's digital art portfolio had generated over $2 million. He had kept every penny of it secret, stored in cryptocurrency wallets and investment accounts his parents knew nothing about. He had told himself he was saving it for his future, for the day when he could finally break free from their expectations and live life on his own terms. Now, looking at those accounts from his hospital bed, Kofi realized that future had arrived sooner than he expected. Over the next 2 days, he made careful plans. He reached out through encrypted messages to a lawyer he had consulted months ago about emancipation and financial independence. He explained his situation. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Linda Chen, had been horrified by what he described. "Your parents are planning your funeral while you're alive and conscious," she had confirmed. "That's beyond cruel. It's potentially criminal. What do you want to do?" Kofi's response had been clear. "I want to show them exactly who they've been underestimating. I want them to understand what they've lost. And I want to make sure they can never hurt anyone else the way they've hurt me." Linda had outlined a plan. It was bold, possibly vindictive, but perfectly legal. Kofi had approved every detail. On the 29th day, Kofi was strong enough to walk short distances with assistance. The medical team was calling it the most remarkable recovery they had ever witnessed. A young man who had been written off as brain-dead was now talking, moving, thinking clearly. They wanted to celebrate, to publish his case in medical journals. But Kofi had asked them to delay any announcements. "Just a few more days," he had requested. "I need to process everything first. I need to see my family on my own terms." The doctors had agreed, respecting his wishes. That evening, Kofi received a message from Linda. "Everything is in place. The paperwork has been filed. All accounts have been secured and moved beyond their reach. When you're ready, we execute." Kofi had replied with a single word, "Tomorrow." On the 30th day, Kofi discharged himself from the hospital against medical advice. He was still weak, still recovering, but he was mobile enough for what he needed to do. Abina had helped him to a waiting car, tears streaming down her face. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," she had told him. "Whatever you're about to do, I hope it brings you peace." Kofi had hugged her, the first real human warmth he had felt in weeks. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." The car took him to his parents' house, the place he had called home for 19 years. As they approached, Kofi could see unusual activity in the driveway. Cars were parked along the street. People were gathered in the yard. His stomach had turned when he realized what was happening. They were preparing for his funeral. The service was scheduled for the next day, but his parents were hosting a pre-funeral gathering, a chance for extended family and friends to come together before the official ceremony. Kofi could hear music playing, people laughing, the sound of celebration rather than mourning. He had the driver park down the street. He needed a moment to prepare himself for what he was about to do. Through the window, he could see his father, Kwame, standing in the center of a group of people, holding a drink, smiling broadly. He could see his mother, Min-Ji, elegant in a black dress that was far too stylish for someone supposedly grieving her only child. They looked relieved. They looked happy. They looked like people who had been freed from a burden rather than people who had lost their son. Kofi took a deep breath, opened the car door, and stepped out. His legs were shaky, his body still weak from weeks in bed, but his resolve was iron strong. He walked slowly up the driveway, each step deliberate. The first person to notice him was his aunt, his father's sister. She had been laughing at something when she turned and saw him. Her glass had slipped from her fingers, shattering on the concrete driveway. The sound had cut through the conversation like a gunshot. Everyone had turned to look. The music had continued playing for a few seconds before someone thought to turn it off. In the sudden silence, Kofi kept walking. He could see faces going through stages of shock, confusion, disbelief, and then something like horror. His mother had been in mid-sentence when she saw him. The words had died in her throat. Her face had gone completely white. His father had been laughing just seconds before. Now he stood frozen, his mouth open, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear. Kofi had reached the center of the gathering and stopped. Everyone was staring at him like he was a ghost. In a way, he supposed he was. "This isn't possible," Kwame had finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors said you were brain dead. They said you would never wake up." Kofi had looked at his father with eyes that held no affection, no warmth, nothing but cold, hard clarity. "The doctors said I had a 5% chance of recovery," he had replied, his voice steady despite his physical weakness. "Apparently, I beat the odds." Min-Ji had taken a step forward, her hand outstretched as if to touch him, to verify he was real. "Kofi, baby, you're awake. This is a miracle. We've been praying every day for you to come back to us." Kofi had stepped back from her reach. "Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless." Have you really been praying for me to wake up?" The question hung in the air like a blade. "Because that's not what I heard." Min-Ji's expression had flickered, uncertainty replacing her mask of maternal concern. "What do you mean?" "You heard." Kwame had interrupted, his voice sharp with sudden understanding. "You could hear us." "When?" Kofi had looked around at the gathered crowd, at the black clothing everyone wore, at the funeral programs already printed and stacked on a table, at the large photograph of himself displayed like a memorial. Since the beginning, he had said clearly, projecting his voice so everyone could hear. "I could hear everything from the very first day." The silence that followed was suffocating. "I heard you," he continued, looking directly at his father, talking about how much of a burden I was. "I heard you discussing my medical costs like I was a bad investment. I heard you tell Mom that maybe it was nature's way of ending my suffering." Kwame's face had flushed red. "Son, you misunderstood. We were in shock. We didn't mean those things." Kofi had turned to his mother. "And you? I heard you researching the cheapest long-term care facilities. I heard you calculating how much money you would save if I died. I heard you tell Dad that I'd been disappointing you since I was born. Min-Ji had started crying, but the tears looked performative, calculated. You don't understand. We were devastated. We were trying to cope with the possibility of losing you. We said things we didn't mean because we were in pain. Kofi had felt nothing but contempt. You were in pain? I was the one lying in that bed, paralyzed, conscious, trapped in my own body, forced to listen to my parents celebrate my death. You signed a DNR order. You literally gave the hospital permission to let me die if my heart stopped. Gasps had rippled through the crowd. Family members who had been smiling and socializing moments before now looked uncomfortable, embarrassed, caught witnessing something they wished they could unsee. An uncle had spoken up, trying to mediate. Kofi, I'm sure your parents were just trying to make difficult decisions in an impossible situation. Kofi had turned to face the crowd. They were planning their post-death vacation. They were talking about remodeling the house with the money they would save. They discussed my funeral arrangements like they were planning a dinner party. Does that sound like grief to you? More silence. People wouldn't meet his eyes. That's not fair, Kwame had protested weakly. You're twisting our words, taking things out of context. Kofi had pulled out his phone. Before I woke up, I had Nurse Sabina record some of your visits. Would you like me to play them for everyone here? Would you like your family and friends to hear exactly what you said? The color had drained from both his parents' faces. You recorded us, Min-Ji had whispered. That's illegal. That's a violation of privacy. Kofi had laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. You're talking to me about violations? You violated every single responsibility a parent has to a child. You violated the basic human decency of not celebrating someone's death while they're still alive. Don't lecture me about violations. His father had tried a different approach, his voice turning aggressive. Fine. We said some things we shouldn't have. But you have no idea what it was like for us, sitting in that hospital day after day, watching you lie there like a vegetable, watching our savings drain away. We're human. We made mistakes. But we're still your parents. Kofi had felt something cold and final settle in his chest. No, he had said quietly. You're not. Not anymore. As of this morning, I legally emancipated myself. I'm no longer your son in any legal sense. At 19, with proof of financial independence and evidence of parental unfitness, a judge signed the papers. Min-Ji had gasped. Financial independence. You're a student. You have nothing. Kofi had smiled for the first time, and it was not a pleasant expression. That's where you're wrong. While you were dismissing my art as a useless hobby, while you were mocking my creative pursuits, I was building something. For the past 2 years, I've been creating and selling digital art. I've generated over $2 million in income that you knew nothing about. The crowd had erupted in shocked whispers. Kwame had shaken his head violently. That's impossible. You're lying. Kofi had pulled up his phone, showing them bank statements, transaction records, proof of every sale. I'm not lying. I'm a successful artist. I'm financially independent. And as of today, you have no legal claim to me or my assets. He had looked at both of them with finality. I also filed a civil suit against you this morning for emotional distress and attempted financial exploitation. My lawyer has documented everything, including your signed DNR order and your statements about wanting me to die. Min-Ji had dropped to her knees, her composure finally cracking. No, please, Kofi. We're your parents. We made mistakes, but we love you. We've always loved you. Kofi had looked down at her without pity. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. You don't know what love is. Love doesn't calculate the cost of keeping someone alive. Love doesn't plan vacations while someone is in a coma. Love doesn't sign paperwork to let someone die because it's more convenient. Kwame had taken a step forward, his expression turning dark. You ungrateful little bastard. After everything we did for you, after all the money we spent raising you, this is how you repay us. Kofi had met his father's anger with ice-cold calm. Everything you did for me. You mean providing basic necessities that the law required you to provide? You mean feeding and housing me while making sure I knew I was never good enough? You mean accepting my money from part-time jobs to help with bills while you owned 2 businesses? That's not parenting. That's exploitation. And several guests had started leaving, uncomfortable with the confrontation, embarrassed to be associated with what was clearly a family implosion. Kofi had watched them go, then turned back to his parents. I also want you to know that I've withdrawn every penny I ever contributed to this household. My lawyer calculated it at approximately $57,000 over the years. I've transferred it from your business accounts. It's mine now, compensation for years of unpaid labor. You can't do that, Kwame had shouted. That's theft. Kofi had shaken his head. It's not theft when it was my money to begin with. Every dollar I earned and gave you, documented. Every contribution, recorded. My lawyer made sure everything was legal. You're insane, Min-Ji had spat, her grief transforming into rage. You're an ungrateful, selfish child. After everything we sacrificed for you. Kofi had felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast emptiness where familial love should have been. You sacrificed nothing. You had a child because you wanted one, and then you spent 19 years making sure I knew I was a disappointment. Well, congratulations. You're free now. Free from your burden. Free from your obligation. Free from me. He had turned to leave, and that's when Min-Ji had played her final card. Wait, she had called out, her voice desperate. You can't just leave. We're family. Blood means something. Kofi had paused, looked back over his shoulder. Blood means you share DNA. It doesn't mean you love someone. It doesn't mean you deserve their loyalty. You taught me that. He had started walking again. His father had shouted after him. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back when you realize how hard the world is. When your little art career fails, when you need help, you'll remember who your real family is. Kofi had kept walking. He heard his mother's voice, shrill and breaking. We could have let you die. We could have pulled the plug. We kept you alive, and this is how you thank us. He had stopped one more time, turned around, and delivered his final words to them. You kept me alive because pulling the plug would have looked bad. You kept me alive because you were afraid of judgment from others, not because you cared about me. And for that tiny shred of decency, I suppose I should thank you. But I don't. Because I heard what you said when you thought no one was listening. I know who you really are. Then he had walked away from that house, from those people, from that life, and he never looked back. The driver took him to a hotel, a nice one, where he had booked a suite for the next month while he figured out his next steps. As he lay in the clean, quiet room that night, his body exhausted but his mind clear, Kofi reflected on everything that had happened. For 19 years, he had believed that love was earned through perfection. He had believed that if he just tried hard enough, sacrificed enough, achieved enough, his parents would finally be proud of him, would finally see his worth. The accident had torn away that illusion in the cruelest way possible. But it had also freed him. He was no longer the desperate boy seeking approval. He was someone who understood his own value, who recognized that his worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition of it. Over the following weeks, Kofi focused on his recovery. He did physical therapy to rebuild his strength. He met with therapists to process the trauma of everything he had experienced. He reconnected with friends he had drifted away from during his years of trying to be the perfect son. And he made art. He created a series of pieces about his experience, raw and powerful works that explored themes of survival, betrayal, and rebirth. The series sold out within hours of being released, earning him another $1 million and cementing his reputation as one of the most exciting new voices in digital art. His parents tried to contact him multiple times. His father sent emails that alternated between apology and rage. His mother left voicemails that ranged from tearful pleas to angry accusations. He blocked them all. There was nothing they could say that would change what he knew to be true about them. About 2 months after leaving the hospital, Kofi received a message from Abina, the nurse who had believed in him when no one else did. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. She told him that his parents had come to the hospital asking questions about his recovery, trying to understand how he had woken up, looking for some medical explanation they could use to challenge his emancipation or his financial independence. The doctors had refused to speak with them, citing patient confidentiality. Abina had also mentioned that she had heard through mutual acquaintances that Kwame and Min-Ji's reputation in the community had been destroyed. People who had been at that gathering had talked. Word had spread about what they had said, about how they had celebrated their son's anticipated death, about the DNR order, about everything. Their restaurants had seen a significant drop in customers. People didn't want to support business owners who had treated their own child so callously. The rental properties were fine financially, but socially, they had become pariahs. Kofi felt nothing when he heard this. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even pity. He simply felt indifferent, which he supposed was the truest sign that he had moved on. 6 months after waking up, Kofi was featured in a major art magazine. The interview focused not just on his work but on his story. He spoke carefully, not out of spite but out of honesty, about growing up as the son of immigrants who had confused achievement with love, about the pressure to be perfect, about the accident and the recovery. He didn't name his parents specifically, but anyone who knew them would recognize the story. The article went viral. It sparked conversations about parental expectations, about the pressure placed on children of immigrants, about the difference between supporting children and exploiting them. Kofi received thousands of messages from people who related to his experience, who had their own stories of parental disappointment and conditional love. He realized his story wasn't unique. It was tragically common. So he did something with his platform. He established a foundation to help young artists whose families didn't support their creative pursuits. He funded scholarships, provided equipment and studio space, and created mentorship programs. He turned his pain into purpose, his trauma into transformation. 1 year after the accident, Kofi held his first major solo exhibition at a prestigious gallery. The opening night was packed with collectors, critics, and fellow artists. His work, which explored themes of identity, survival, and transformation, received critical acclaim. Several pieces sold for 6 figures each. As he stood in the gallery, surrounded by people who appreciated his art, who saw his value, who celebrated his talent, Kofi felt something he had never experienced in his parents' house: genuine belonging. That night, as the exhibition was winding down, Kofi noticed 2 figures standing at the entrance. His body tensed before his mind fully registered who they were. Kwame and Min-Ji had found him. They looked different than he remembered. His father appeared older, his shoulders stooped, his face drawn. His mother's elegance had been replaced with something harder, more desperate. They approached him slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Kofi," his father began, his voice lacking its former confidence. "We've been trying to reach you." Kofi looked at them with the detachment of someone observing strangers. "I've blocked your numbers. That should have communicated my wishes clearly." "Please," his mother interrupted, tears already forming in her eyes. "We need to talk to you. We need to explain." Kofi glanced around the gallery. This wasn't the place for a confrontation. Several people were already watching with interest. "If you want to talk," he said evenly, "we can do it outside." They followed him out to a small courtyard behind the gallery. The night air was cool, the sound of the city muffled by distance. "All right," Kofi said, crossing his arms. "You have 5 minutes." Kwame took a deep breath. "We came to apologize. What we said in the hospital, what we did, it was unforgivable. We were wrong. We were cruel. We were terrible parents, and we're sorry." Min-Ji nodded eagerly. "We've had a year to think about it, to realize how badly we failed you. We want to make it right. We want to be part of your life again." Kofi studied them silently for a long moment. "Your restaurants," he finally said. "I heard business has been difficult. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless." Kwame's expression flickered with something that looked like shame. "Yes," he admitted. They've been boycotting us. The community has turned against us." Min-Ji added quickly, "But that's not why we're here. We're not here for money or help with the business. We genuinely want to repair our relationship with you." Kofi nodded slowly. "I see. And if my art career had failed? If I had woken up from that coma with brain damage, unable to work, unable to support myself? If I had needed you? Would you be here then?" The question hung in the air. His parents exchanged a glance but said nothing. "That's what I thought," Kofi said. "You're here because I succeeded despite you, not because you actually love me. You're here because your comfortable life has been disrupted, and you think reconciling with me might restore your reputation." His father protested. "That's not fair. We're your parents. We made mistakes, yes, but we raised you. We provided for you." Kofi felt a flash of the old anger, but he controlled it. "You provided the bare minimum required by law. You fed me, housed me, clothed me. Congratulations. You met the basic legal definition of parenting. But you never saw me. You never valued me. You only valued what I could do for you." Min-Ji wiped her eyes. "We were wrong. We admit it. But family is family. You can't just walk away from your parents." Kofi laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Can't I? I legally emancipated myself. In the eyes of the law, you're not my parents anymore. And in my heart, you stopped being my parents the moment you signed that DNR order. You stopped being my parents when you celebrated my death. You stopped being my parents when you showed me that your love was conditional, transactional, and ultimately hollow. Please," his mother begged. "We can change. We can be better. Give us another chance." Kofi shook his head. "I gave you 19 years of chances. I gave you every morning I woke up early to make you breakfast. I gave you every night I stayed up late studying to make you proud. I gave you every achievement, every sacrifice, every moment I bent myself into shapes trying to earn your love. And what did you give me in return? Criticism. Disappointment. The clear message that I was never enough." His father's voice turned harder. "So what? You're just going to throw away your entire family because we made mistakes?" Kofi met his eyes steadily. "You're not my family. Family doesn't celebrate when you're dying. Family doesn't plan vacations while you're in a coma. Family doesn't sign paperwork to let you die because it's financially convenient. You're the people who raised me, but you're not my family." Kwame's face flushed with anger, the old familiar rage breaking through. "You ungrateful child. After everything we did for you. We gave up so much to come to this country, to build a life here, to give you opportunities." Kofi felt nothing. "You came here for yourselves, for your own opportunities. You had a child because you wanted one, and then you spent 19 years making sure I knew I owed you for existing. That's not sacrifice. That's manipulation." Min-Ji changed tactics, her voice becoming sharp. "You know what? Maybe we were right about you. Maybe you are selfish. Maybe you are a disappointment. Look at you, throwing away your family for what? For pride? For revenge?" Kofi smiled slightly. "No, not for revenge. For peace. For the first time in my life, I'm at peace. I'm making art I love. I'm surrounded by people who value me for who I am, not what I can do for them. I'm living authentically, without constantly trying to meet impossible standards. That's not revenge. That's freedom. His father took a step forward, his voice turning threatening. You think you're free? You think you can just erase us from your life? We're your parents. That connection doesn't just disappear because you want it to. Kofi stood his ground. Watch me. I've already erased you from every document, every legal tie, every financial connection. The only thing left is this conversation, and it's over now. Please leave. Min-Ji's composure finally cracked completely. Fine. Go ahead, live your little artist life. But when things get hard, when your luck runs out, when you need family, don't come crawling back to us. We won't be there. Kofi felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Good. That's the first honest thing you've said tonight. I don't want you there. I don't need you there. I've built a life without you, and it's better than anything I ever had with you. He turned to walk back into the gallery, then paused and looked back one final time. You came here tonight hoping for reconciliation. You came hoping I would forgive you, welcome you back, maybe help restore your reputation and your business. But I want you to understand something clearly. I don't forgive you. Not because I'm holding on to anger, but because forgiveness would imply that what you did was forgivable. It wasn't. You're not sorry you hurt me. You're sorry you got caught, sorry there were consequences, sorry your comfortable life was disrupted. Real remorse would have come months ago, before your business suffered, before your reputation tanked. This isn't apology. It's damage control. His mother's face hardened. You'll regret this. Kofi shook his head. The only thing I regret is wasting 19 years trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. And with that, he walked back into the gallery, leaving Kwame and Min-Ji standing in the courtyard, their last attempt at reconciliation shattered. Inside, he was greeted by friends, collectors, people who celebrated his work and valued his presence. He spent the rest of the evening surrounded by genuine connection, by people who saw him, who appreciated him, who proved that family isn't always blood. Sometimes family is the people you choose, the people who choose you back. 2 years after the accident, Kofi's life had transformed completely. His art career had flourished beyond his wildest dreams. He had exhibited in galleries around the world, from New York to Seoul to London. His foundation had helped hundreds of young artists pursue their dreams. He had built a community of creative people who supported each other, who celebrated each other's successes without jealousy or condition. He had also met someone, a fellow artist named Amora, who understood his journey, who had her own complicated family history, who loved him not for what he achieved but for who he was. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. They moved in together, creating a home filled with art, with light, with the kind of love Kofi had once thought was impossible. He thought about his parents occasionally, but the thoughts came less frequently as time passed and carried less emotional weight when they did. He heard through distant connections that their businesses had stabilized but never fully recovered. They had moved to a smaller house, downsized their lifestyle, retreated from the community that had once celebrated them. He felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy at this news. He simply felt nothing, which was perhaps the clearest sign that he had truly healed. One evening, as Kofi and Amora sat in their studio working on separate pieces, she asked him a question. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't woken up from the coma? Kofi considered this. Sometimes. But I think in a way, the old me didn't wake up. The boy who spent 19 years trying to be perfect, trying to earn love through achievement, that boy died in that hospital bed. The person who woke up was someone different. Someone who understood that his worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition of it. Amora nodded. I think that's what makes your art so powerful. It comes from someone who understands suffering but refuses to be defined by it. That night, Kofi created one final piece about his parents. It was a large-scale digital work showing a hospital room, a still figure in a bed, and two shadowy figures standing over it. But in this version, the figure in the bed was transparent, glowing, already gone, while the shadows remained solid, trapped. He titled it The Weight of What We Carry and wrote in the description, "This piece explores the moment I realized that the people I had been carrying in my heart had never carried me in theirs. It's about the freedom that comes from putting down burdens that were never yours to carry. It's about the rebirth that happens when you stop dying for people who were already planning your funeral." The piece sold for $750,000, with all proceeds going to his foundation. The buyer, a collector who had followed his career from the beginning, told him, "This is your masterpiece. Not because of the technique or the composition, but because of what it represents, the moment you stopped surviving and started living." 3 years after the accident, Kofi was invited to give a TED Talk. He stood on that stage in front of thousands of people and told his story. He spoke about the accident, about the coma, about hearing his parents celebrate his death, about the long road to recovery and independence. He spoke about the difference between being alive and being truly living. The talk went viral, reaching millions of people around the world. He received messages from people in similar situations, from children of immigrants struggling with impossible expectations, from anyone who had ever felt unseen by the people who were supposed to love them most. Many of the messages broke his heart because he recognized his own pain in them. But many also inspired him because they showed people choosing themselves, choosing freedom, choosing to live authentically rather than performing for approval. After the TED Talk, he received one more message from his parents. It came through a mutual acquaintance who felt obligated to pass it along. The message was from his mother, "We watched your talk. We finally understand what we did to you. We don't expect forgiveness. We just wanted you to know that we're proud of you, for whatever that's worth now." Kofi read the message once, then deleted it. Their pride, offered now after years of absence, after he no longer needed it, after he had built an entire life proving he never needed it, was meaningless. It was the perfect example of too little, too late, offered not out of genuine growth but out of the discomfort of being publicly exposed. He didn't respond. 4 years after the accident, Kofi stood in a private gallery in Seoul, his mother's home country, for an exhibition celebrating Korean diaspora artists. The work displayed represented his journey, the struggle of immigrant families, the pressure of expectations, the pain of cultural displacement, the beauty of finding yourself when you stop trying to be what others need you to be. An elderly Korean woman approached him at the exhibition. She looked at his work for a long time before speaking. "You understand, Han," she said, using the Korean word for a particular type of sorrow, a grief mixed with injustice, a pain that stays in the soul. Kofi nodded. "I think I do. My mother is Korean. She tried to teach me about Han when I was young, but I didn't understand it then. I understand it now." The woman smiled sadly. "But you also understand Jong, the connection that binds people together. Even when it's painful, even when it's complicated, it's still there." Kofi considered this. "With respect, I think I've learned that some connections should be cut. That Jong isn't always healthy, that binding yourself to people who hurt you isn't loyalty. It's self-destruction." The woman nodded slowly. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps knowing when to let go is its own kind of wisdom." 5 years after the accident, Kofi received news that his father had died. A sudden heart attack, unexpected, quick. Min-Ji had tried to contact him through every channel she could find, but Kofi had built walls that couldn't be breached. By the time he heard the news, the funeral had already happened. He sat with the information for several days, examining his feelings. He expected to feel something, sadness, regret, even relief. Instead, he felt the same vast emptiness he had felt for years when he thought of his parents. His father's death changed nothing because his father had been dead to him for years already. Amora asked if he wanted to reach out to his mother, to offer condolences, to bridge the gap in this moment of loss. Kofi shook his head. She lost her son years ago when she signed that DNR order. She lost her son when she celebrated my death. Kwame's death doesn't change that. I'm not obligated to comfort someone who showed me no mercy when I needed it most. But he did create one more piece of art. It was a memorial, not to his father, but to the boy he had been before the accident. The boy who believed love could be earned through perfection. The boy who killed himself trying to meet impossible standards. The boy who needed to die so that Kofi could truly live. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. Years continued to pass. Kofi's career reached heights he had never imagined. He had museum retrospectives, permanent collections, international recognition. His foundation had grown into a major organization, helping thousands of young artists every year. He married Amora in a small ceremony surrounded by chosen family, people who had proven their love through action, not blood. They eventually had a child, a daughter they named Grace. And Kofi made a silent promise to her on the day she was born. He promised to see her, really see her, for who she was, not who he needed her to be. He promised to love her unconditionally, not transactionally. He promised that she would never have to earn his approval because it would be freely given. He promised that she would know, from her first breath to his last, that she was enough, exactly as she was. One evening, when Grace was about 3 years old, she brought him a drawing she had made. It was chaotic, colorful, completely lacking in technical skill, and absolutely perfect. Kofi held it up like it was a masterpiece. "This is beautiful," he told her. She beamed. "You really like it, Daddy?" He pulled her into his lap. "I love it. Do you know why?" She shook her head. "Because you made it," he said simply. "Because it came from you. That's what makes it special." She hugged him tightly, and in that moment, Kofi understood that he had broken the cycle. The pain ended with him. The conditional love ended with him. The impossible expectations ended with him. He had turned his trauma into transformation, his suffering into strength, his pain into purpose. That night, after Grace had gone to bed, Amora found Kofi in his studio. He was standing in front of a large canvas, not painting, just staring. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "I was just thinking about my parents. About how they planned my funeral while I was still alive. About how they showed me, in the cruelest way possible, that their love was never real." Amora came to stand beside him. And I'm grateful," he said. She looked at him in surprise. "Grateful?" He turned to face her. "If they had loved me, if they had been good parents, I might never have learned to see my own worth independent of other people's opinions. I might never have found the strength to build this life. I might never have understood what real love looks like so I could give it to Grace. Their cruelty set me free in a way their love never could have." Amora was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard-won wisdom." Kofi nodded. "The hardest kind. But it's mine. They tried to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed." 12 years after the accident, Kofi received a final message about his mother. She had died, alone in a nursing home, her remaining family distant, her friends few. The message came from a social worker who was trying to settle her affairs. No one had claimed the body. No one had made funeral arrangements. The social worker, going through Minute Ji's belongings, had found old newspaper clippings about Kofi's success. She had apparently followed his career from afar, collecting articles, saving images of his work. The social worker asked if Kofi wanted to be involved in the funeral arrangements, if he wanted any of his mother's belongings, if he wanted closure. Kofi thought about it for a long time. He thought about the woman who had carried him for 9 months, who had given him life, who had also shown him the cruelest kind of rejection. He thought about the complexity of their relationship, about the pain she had caused, about the freedom that pain had ultimately given him. In the end, he paid for a simple cremation and a small memorial service. He didn't attend. Instead, he sent a letter to be read at the service, addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to the universe, perhaps to the handful of people who might show up. The letter read, Min-Ji lived a life of expectations. She expected perfection from those around her and was disappointed when humanity proved inevitable. She expected love to be earned rather than given and created relationships of transaction rather than connection. She expected her son to be grateful for the life she provided and couldn't understand why he walked away. In her final years, I'm told she followed my career, collected articles about my success, perhaps felt pride or perhaps felt regret. I'll never know which, and it no longer matters. I paid for this service not out of obligation or love, but out of a final act of closure. This is the last thing I will ever do that connects me to her. After today, she becomes memory, then history, then dust. I hope she finds in death the peace she could never find in life. I hope she understands, wherever consciousness goes, that love cannot be demanded or earned. It can only be given freely or not at all. To those gathered here, you knew a different version of her than I did. Your grief is valid. Your memories are yours. I don't seek to color them with my experience. I simply acknowledge that we knew different people who happened to share the same name. Goodbye, Min-Ji. You gave me life, and then you showed me why I needed to live it far from you. In a strange way, both were necessary gifts. After that, Kofi never spoke of his parents again. They became a closed chapter, a finished story, a part of his history that informed who he was but no longer controlled who he would become. 20 years after the accident, Kofi sat in a major museum where a retrospective of his life's work was being displayed. Grace, now a teenager with her own artistic talents, sat beside him. They walked through the exhibition together, and Grace asked the question she had asked many times before but in many different ways, why don't I have grandparents? Kofi had always answered honestly but age-appropriately. Now, with her old enough to understand, he told her the full story. He told her about the accident, about the coma, about what he had heard. He told her about the funeral they had planned while he was still alive. He told her about waking up and choosing to leave them behind. Grace listened quietly, her expression moving through shock, anger, sadness, and finally understanding. So you cut them out completely, she said. Yes, Kofi confirmed. That must have been hard, she said. He considered this. The hardest thing I ever did. But also the most necessary. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Kofi looked at his daughter, at this beautiful, confident, loved child who would never doubt her worth, who would never perform for approval, who was being raised with unconditional love. Not for a single day, he said. Because choosing to leave them meant choosing to become the person I needed to be to break the cycle, to make sure you never experienced what I experienced. Grace hugged him. I'm glad you chose yourself, Dad. I'm glad you chose us. They continued walking through the exhibition. The final room contained the piece that had started everything, the self-portrait he had created at 19, just weeks before the accident. It showed a young man fragmented, trying to hold himself together, pieces of him scattered like broken glass. Next to it hung a recent self-portrait. This one showed a man whole, complete, surrounded by light, rooted firmly in the ground, branches reaching toward the sky. The contrast was stark, the transformation complete. A journalist approached them, asking for a quote for an article about the retrospective. Mr. Asante, she said, your work chronicles one of the most remarkable transformation narratives in contemporary art. What would you say to people who are struggling with family trauma, who feel trapped by obligation to people who hurt them? Kofi thought carefully before responding. I would say that family is not defined by blood. It's defined by love, respect, and mutual support. If the people who share your DNA can't provide those things, you're not obligated to keep them in your life out of some misguided sense of duty. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. Leaving toxic family isn't betrayal. It's survival. It's choosing yourself when no one else will. And sometimes, the people who try to bury you don't realize they're planting seeds. They don't realize that what they meant to destroy might grow into something more beautiful than they could ever imagine. The journalist asked one more question. Do you think there's any circumstance under which you would have reconciled with your parents? Kofi glanced at Grace, then back at the journalist. There was a window, very early on, where genuine remorse might have made a difference. If they had acknowledged their cruelty immediately, if they had done the work to understand why what they did was unforgivable, if they had sought to change not because of consequences but because they recognized they were wrong, maybe. But that window closed when they showed up years later, only after their reputation and business suffered, looking for reconciliation not out of love but out of damage control. Real remorse doesn't wait for consequences. Real change doesn't come from being caught. They were sorry they got exposed, not sorry they hurt me. That's not apology. That's public relations. The exhibition ran for 6 months and broke attendance records. Kofi's story resonated with millions of people around the world who had their own versions of family trauma, their own stories of conditional love, their own journeys toward choosing themselves. The final statistics were staggering. His foundation had helped over 10,000 young artists. His art had sold for tens of millions of dollars. His TED Talk had been viewed over 50 million times. His books about creativity and healing had become international bestsellers. But the number that mattered most to Kofi was one: Grace. One child raised with unconditional love. One child who would never doubt her worth. One child who proved that cycles could be broken, that generational trauma could end, that love could be learned even by those who had never received it. On the final day of the retrospective, Kofi stood alone in the exhibition after hours. He looked at 20 years of work, at the visual diary of his transformation from broken boy to whole man. He thought about the journey, about the pain that had made it necessary, about the strength he had found in places he didn't know existed. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Amora and Grace. They had sent a photo of them at home, making dinner together, laughing at some private joke. The image was full of warmth, of joy, of uncomplicated love. Kofi smiled. This was what he had been searching for all those years when he was trying to earn his parents' approval. This feeling of being home, of being seen, of being loved not for what he achieved but for who he was. He had found it, but not where he expected. He had found it by having the courage to walk away from people who couldn't give it, by building his own family, by becoming the parent he had needed. As he left the museum that night, walking out into a city alive with light and possibility, Kofi thought about the 20-year-old boy who had lain in a hospital bed, paralyzed and conscious, listening to his parents plan his funeral. That boy had been certain he was dying. In a way, he had been right. The boy who believed love could be earned through perfection did die in that hospital. But someone else had been born. Someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who understood that the deepest love is the love we give ourselves when no one else will. Kofi walked home through streets he had walked 1,000 times, but tonight they felt different. Tonight, they felt like the streets of a man who had survived the unsurvivable, who had transformed trauma into art, who had broken cycles and built legacies. Tonight, they felt like freedom. At home, Grace ran to hug him as soon as he walked through the door. "Dad, did you have a good time at the museum?" He held her close, breathing in the simple miracle of this moment, a child who knew she was loved, who ran toward him rather than away, who had never had to earn her place in his heart. "I had a perfect time," he said. And he meant it. The moral of this story is simple but profound. People reveal who they truly are when they believe you cannot hear them, when they think you are powerless, when they believe there will be no consequences for their cruelty. When people celebrate your downfall, when they plan your funeral while you still breathe, when they show you that their love was always conditional, believe them. And when you survive what they hoped would destroy you, don't waste time on revenge. Build something beautiful instead. Transform your pain into purpose. Use your trauma as fertilizer for growth. Become so successful, so whole, so completely yourself that their absence from your life becomes your greatest blessing. The people who tried to bury you never realized you were a seed. Let them learn that lesson by watching you bloom. Thank you so much for staying with this story until the very end. If Kofi's journey moved you, if you've ever felt unseen by the people who should have seen you, if you've ever had to make the difficult choice to walk away from toxic family, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Where are you watching from? What part of this story resonated with you the most? Your stories matter, your experiences matter, you matter. Please like this video if it touched your heart. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in their struggle with family trauma. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might change your perspective or give you the courage to change your life. Remember, you are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You are not required to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You are worthy of unconditional love, and if you can't find it in your family of origin, you have every right to build a family of choice. More stories like this are coming. Stories of people who survived impossible situations, who transformed their trauma into triumph, who chose themselves when no one else would. Don't miss them. Until next time, remember, you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become. And sometimes the most radical act of self-love is walking away from people who can't love you back.